distinguished guests, and all of our fabulous people that are joining us for Earth Day. Welcome. My name is Michelle DePass, and I'm the Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy, and also have the fantastic distinction of being the director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center. So I want to welcome you all here today. We're really excited to celebrate with you a part of what we call TED-C, our inaugural Earth Day event, Earth Matters, Designing Our Future. Throughout the day, we're hosting panels and discussions on climate action and sustainability spanning the disciplines. We've already had 2 great panels earlier today on sustainable fashion and sustainable food systems. And we're continuing the momentum with this very special event, Cities Under Siege, a climate resiliency panel. We have a great group of speakers here today, and later they'll be introduced to you. As you can see from today's range of programming, TED-C uses the power of interdisciplinary collaboration to confront one of the most important issues of our time, climate change. This is a particularly exciting event for us because we've been focusing efforts through our research and on-the-ground action to build climate resilience in the New York City area and the region. We've held really interesting convenings recently, like our recent tribunal on failed governance and the next week's conference on disaster recovery. So please join us. You can always find our events on Eventbrite at the Milano and New School website. Today's moderator, Dr. Timon McPhearson, has been on the forefront of such efforts. In fact, some of Timon's research will be featured in the New York Times Magazine on Sunday in their special feature on walkability. Dr. McPhearson is an assistant professor of urban ecology and research faculty at the New School's Tishman Environment and Design Center, where he works directly with designers, planners, and managers to foster sustainable and climate resilient cities. He directs the Urban Ecology Lab, which investigates the ecology in, of, and for cities, and teaches urban resilience, systems thinking, and urban ecology at the university. Dr. McPhearson is co-leading the urban platform with Future Earth, the largest scientific organization in the world. He's a contributing author to the first global assessment of urban biodiversity at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity's Cities Biodiversity Outlook, and is a member of the Urban Climate Change Research Network. Phew, that's a lot. One more. His work is published widely, including in scientific journals, Nature Landscape and Urban Planning, and Urban Ecosystems, in books and popular press, and covered by the New York Times, The Nation, and other widely read press. It is important, actually, for our intellectuals and researchers at the New School to get their proper due, because it's important for everybody to know the breadth of what we do here. So, welcome, Timon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's really great to have you here. We have an amazing group of panelists today to discuss the climate change issue in cities, and really in particular in New York City, and to think about how we can improve the resilience of our city to the coming impacts of climate change. So as you know, we live on a very urbanizing planet, with the pace of population growth expanding so rapidly that the world's urban population is expected to double in 35 years. That means going from about 3.5 billion people living in cities to about 7 billion people living in cities in just 35 years. Even in the United States, we're expecting another 90 million urban residents, and I'm sure that New York is going to get its share. At the same time, we know that the planet's warming. As you probably noticed last year, 2014 was the warmest year on record, and this year is shaping up to be another warm one as well. If you've been following the news on this, March is the warmest March on record globally, following after last year. And when you look at new climate projection data from the climate models, we see that the world, all around the world, is definitely being affected by climate change, particularly in cities as well as in rural areas. Temperatures are going up everywhere, and in some places quite dramatically. When you look at precipitation, for example, you see that it's going up and down and depends on where you are in the world. Of course, what I'm showing you here are average projection data, meaning It's a global average calculated for these periods for those time periods in the 2020s and 2050s and 2080s. But people don't experience average temperatures. Climate-driven extreme events are probably the most immediate way people experience climate change. How many of you were here during Hurricane Sandy? Many of you. So you know how much work we have to do to build climate resilience to these kinds of challenges, and not only in New York, but in other places. One example, if you look at Phoenix, for example, you probably think hot and dry, or at least I do. But last year, Phoenix was brought to a complete halt by a 500-year flood storm. And the local climatologist called this, 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000-year kind of storm. And 3 weeks later, it was hit by another 100-year flood. So now Phoenix has to be thinking about flooding as a result of how the climate is changing. Clearly, urbanization and climate change are on a collision course, and we need to be prepared. And so that's what we're gathering together for the next couple hours to talk about, is how the group that's assembled here can think about how New York City can be prepared, and what are the implications of what we're doing here for other cities around the world, and of course the connections between them. So I'm going to introduce each panelist in turn, and they're going to give short presentations, really to help you get introduced to their work. We'll start first with Dan Zarrilli, and then Cynthia Rosenzweig, and then Adam Parris, and then Mary Rowe, and I'll introduce each one in turn. So what I'd like you to do, please, is save your questions for the end. We'll have each of the panelists go one after the other, and then they'll join me up here at the front of the room, and we'll open it up to you for questions after that. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dan Zarrilli. Dan, we're very excited to have you here today. I know you've been quite busy, and if the rest of you haven't been following, there's a major launch by the mayor's office today of One NYC, the new plan for New York. And Dan is in the middle of a very busy day, so we're grateful that he could join us. Dan Zarrilli was appointed in March 2014 by Mayor de Blasio as the director of the Office of Recovery and Resiliency for the City of New York, leading the implementation of a stronger, more resilient New York, which is the city's comprehensive climate resiliency plan. And this plan is to strengthen coastal protection, upgrade buildings, improve infrastructure, and make neighborhoods safer and more vibrant. It's also worth mentioning that Dan is also part of FEMA's National Advisory Council and is also serving on the Resiliency Technical Advisory Panel for the state of Louisiana and their 2017 Coastal Master Plan update. Dan served as the acting director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, and prior to this, he was named the city's first director of resiliency in June 2013, following after Sandy and the city's efforts to build resilience post-Sandy. So please welcome Dan Zarrilli.
Yeah, I think that's great. So thank you. Again, my name is Dan Zarrilli. I'm really thrilled to be here today. On Earth Day, we had a great announcement this morning I want to tell you a little bit about, and then just do a little overview of the city's doing on resiliency. For those of you who haven't seen me speak, this is sort of rare not to have slides. For those who haven't seen me speak, you probably don't know how good you have it. So today, Mayor de Blasio released a plan, the One New York, a plan for a strong and just city, which is really a roadmap and a plan for us to, in many ways, prepare for the future, is a blunt way to put it. And think of it in this historical context. In about 10 years, in 10 years, we'll be in the 400th anniversary of New York City. So within that sort of historical construct, it's really interesting to think about what we can do in the next 10 years to prepare for that future, and what sort of city we want to see in that future. And building upon prior plans, and those of you who know of the term the Plan NYC, the prior plans that were put out in the last administration, this is really taking that work, building upon it, and expanding it. And the major themes that have been addressed in prior plans of growth, we're going to have 9 million people in the next in the city by 2040. But also thinking about the threats of climate change, aging infrastructure, an evolving economy. So thinking about sustainability, where are those people going to live? Where are the jobs going to be? How are we going to interact with our environment? And then, of course, after the events of Hurricane Sandy, we really knew we needed to redouble our efforts on resiliency, and in 2013 put out the plan, A Stronger, More Resilient New York, in order to better prepare ourselves for a broad risk of climate impact, certainly not just the next Sandy. and you'll hear all about the scary projections from Cynthia in a minute on what may be coming our way in the not too distant future. The new piece of work that's added to this plan, the One NYC plan, is of course the lens of equity and applying, and addressing inequality in the city and marrying that with our sustainability, resiliency, and growth plans. And we think that's a much more comprehensive approach to this, and you're not going to have a sustainable city without having a sustainable economy and making sure that it works for all New Yorkers. That's this plan. So you can go find this online, nyc.gov /1 NYC. I don't think you can do that in here with the services I've found out. But when you get out of this room, you can go to online and find that. Within this plan, there's a number of major themes. We're making commitments on pulling 800,000 residents out of poverty in the next several years. We're making a major commitment to zero waste and removing the waste that we send to our landfills as a city by 2030, as well as deepening our commitment to 80 by 50, or reducing our greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050. In September, we put out a plan addressing nearly the 3/4 of our emissions that come from buildings. This plan now expanded that into our power sector, our solid waste, and our transportation network to make sure that we can get ourselves on that target for 80 by 50. And then a fourth component that I'm here to talk a little bit more about today, before turning it back over, is really the resiliency program for the city. And Hurricane Sandy really highlighted our vulnerabilities to climate here in New York City. We have 520 miles of shoreline, so we have plenty of vulnerability. Right now we have about 400,000 people that live in our floodplains, and so we are putting in place a range of measures to address that, but we're also looking wider, and it's not just about the next flood, the next coastal storm. We're guided in this by Cynthia's work at the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and really thinking about the broader range of climate risks that are coming our way, and that is increased temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, and then on the more acute side is also heat waves, days above 90 degrees, and the heat waves that we're going to see in the city, as well as the increasing intensity and frequency of flooding due to coastal storms. So with all that, we are continuing to put in place measures. It's a $20 billion program that we're actually putting in place now for our resiliency efforts, and it involves many different investments on our coastline, reducing the vulnerabilities there, but also upgrades to our building code, our zoning code, making sure we're prepared for a range of things that are coming our way, as well as thinking about our infrastructure, and then most fundamentally strengthening the neighborhoods. And one of the major new additions in our resiliency program in this plan is really an effort to think more deeply about social resiliency and community strengthening, and how local organizations and institutions and residents can play a role in the resiliency of their neighborhoods to be able to better recover, withstand impacts, and emerge stronger from events in the future. That's really what this is about. We have a vision for our future of really being able to be ready to withstand the impacts of climate change and other 21st century threats, because we know they're coming. We may not know exactly what's coming next, but we know it's a wide range. And that's what we in New York City are preparing for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks to you for the update on the new plan, and we'll have a chance to ask you some pointed questions about it in a little bit. I want to introduce our next speaker, Cynthia Rosenzweig, and I am very happy that Cynthia's been able to make some time to join us. She's a colleague and a global recognized leader in climate change research, especially in terms of her focus on cities. Cynthia Rosenzweig is a senior research scientist at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, where she heads the Climate Impacts Group. She's a professor at Barnard College and a senior research scientist at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. She's also the coordinating lead author of the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report for one of the working groups, and she's co-directing, thank you, the Urban Climate Change Research Network, which is an important network we mentioned earlier that's very much focused on climate change in cities, and co-editor of the first Urban Climate Change Research Network assessment report on climate change in cities, which is really the first ever global, interdisciplinary, cross-regional, and science-based assessment to address climate risks, adaptation, mitigation, and policy mechanisms relative to cities. So we're delighted that Cynthia can join us today and share some of the critical work she's done modeling climate. Thank you.
Thanks, Timon. All right. Sorry. That's okay. It's great to be here at the New School. It's always really great to come down. And we've, over the years, worked with some of the great folks here, including Joel Towers, Shogun Morocha, Of course, Timon, Michelle DePass, we also worked together when she was at the Ford Foundation, and many others. And it's great on Earth Day to get together and share thoughts about the challenges that climate change pose for cities, but also, very importantly, the role that cities are playing in responding to those challenges. And how are we doing? I have it on a stick. Shall we try that?
Yeah.
Go, back up.
Thank you, back up.
That is, hey, a lesson about resilience, right? That's on
gonna
what
check yours, too.
redundancy.
We checked that.
That's one of the 5. All right, let's have some audience participation. What are the 5 elements of resiliency? Okay, what redundancy is one. Preparedness. All right, come on, folks. What else? Yes, but be more specific. How about safe failure, right? That's one of them. Anyway, in a slide coming later on, that we'll have all 5. Learning. Hey, right here in the New School, learning is one of them. Okay, so Timon also showed this, but this is with the scientists' color legend, going from yellow to red for the very, very hot. And for many years, by the way, this map was only showed with the nation states outlined on this, and no one ever put where the cities were until UCCRN. So this is just clearly every city in the world. These are the projections for 2050s from one of the global climate models. Every city in the world is going to be dealing with, and already is, by the way, because of the urban heat island and the amount of warming that we've had already. So cities are clearly at the forefront of climate change across the globe. They're at the front. They're really at the forefront. They're on the front line in both the cause of climate change and the effect. So let's just look very quickly at first the cause side. So where do greenhouse gas emissions come from, right? They come from where economic activity is primarily it's a major role. Of course, there's also land use and agriculture, which is approximately 25%. But really, on the order of 40 to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from urban areas. Why there's such a big range is it depends how you count. Whether if we're buying something here in New York and it's made elsewhere, does that get into our greenhouse gas footprint? But you can see on the energy side, with what the graph is showing, per capita electricity consumption across the globe. Of course, there are differences in cities depending on what. For example, how much energy? Yes, transit, right? Transit. What, right? Climate zones, right? Do we have to have? Is there a lot of air conditioning? And also level of development. So, but the projections are the data show that about 2/3 of the energy demand is associated with urban areas, and this is projected to increase. So this is on the cause side. Let's look at the effect side. This is what also we were just as we're remembering Hurricane Sandy. Cities and the people who live in them are highly vulnerable to climate extremes, including just the ones that Timon said: extreme heat, intense rainfall, and sea level rise. And this is what the projections show. All the global climate models, we're the home at Goddard Institute for Space Studies of one of them. Now we use about 30 from groups around the world, and they're all agreeing that these are the major threats. So, what is indeed happening, and which is so exciting and truly history in the making, is that cities around the world are emerging as the first responders to climate change these challenges. Now, the very first bullet says, action at the national and international level is slow. Now, we're all really, really, really hoping that this year, at the end of the year in Paris, that the national and global negotiators are finally going to make a serious treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions around the world. But until that happens, the cities they didn't wait for the nation states to get going. And these are some of the examples in the bullets of, there's the C40 Leadership Group, which is, with leadership of the former mayor. The World Mayors Council on Climate Change was launched in 2010. About 200 mayors have already signed voluntary pacts to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. See, the cities don't wait. They say, we're not going to wait. We see that there's a problem. We're just going to roll up our sleeves and get going. And by the way, this is actually now what the nations are finally coming to, that they couldn't make everybody be cookie cutter, right? And now they're doing differentiated responsibility. So they're learning from cities. So there's a lot of really good papers, masters, and PhD dissertations on these topics, because we're actually living this history changing. Like, when we read about the rise of the nation state, well, now we're really seeing cities rising as well. So, turning quickly to New York, to the story of New York, and following on from Dan Zarrilli's talk, really and truly, and because you can see we work with cities all over the world, we can say this, that we're not just being New Yorkers, thinking we're the best. We really are the best. I'm telling you. Because I do believe we are the biggest megacity that is taking the lead on climate change, both on the mitigation side, that with the certainly, and the upping, with the great leadership from Mayor Bloomberg in the beginning, and now with Mayor de Blasio, and upping the 80 by 50 targets, but then also on climate change resiliency, which Dan was really just talking about. So one of the reasons why, I'm talking about from the knowledge provider side and the knowledge partner side, the New York City Panel on Climate Change is a knowledge partner for not just the city of New York, but for the entire metropolitan region. I'm going to talk a tiny bit about that in a moment. And this is one of the reasons why has New York been able not only to establish leadership, but maintain it. It's not just that you do something once, but with climate change, you have to keep doing it and doing it. We have to be flexible. We have to keep it going, basically, forever. One of the reasons is that we have a knowledge group, which is the New York City Panel, made up of experts, and this group has been codified into law, so that every administration of the group of scientists, so it's not an individual, it's not any individuals, it's the body itself. Every administration, the NPCC, has to get together and provide the updated projections to the city. And that's with this challenge of climate change, with the emphasis on change, this updating, learning, evaluating, monitoring, and getting the update science is very, very important. And the latest report just came out. I had brought one to show and to do show and tell, but I was just having a lunch with some of the lead negotiators in Paris, and I gave it to them, and they were very interested. Uh-oh, what happened? Did I just hit something? Oh, no. Oh, dear. Oh, you can? Oh, okay, I just lost it here. Okay, here, it came back. All right, here we go. This is what Timon and Dan said that I was going to show. These are the projections. So I won't go through all the numbers. First of all, you always see a range because there's uncertainties. But there is basically, it's going to get hotter. That's what the temperatures, the infographic are showing. The precipitation is projected to increase, including the intense heavy downpours. Frequency of heat waves is projected to triple as we go through the coming decades. And the sea level rise is expected to rise through the century with potential at the very high estimate, and this is why it is so serious that all of the responses to climate change and reducing the risk and mitigating and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because basically what we need to do on the mitigation side is back away from the high end of those numbers on temperature, on precip, and on sea level rise. And the reason is that on the sea level rise is the final bullet which says that it doesn't matter what happens to the storms themselves. Higher sea level rise will increase the frequency and intensity of coastal flooding absent any change in the storms themselves. And these are the projections of the flooding areas, which are in the NPCC report and used in the SIRR. So basically what the map is showing is, as we go through the decades, green, light green, dark green, yellow, and then red is the 2100. We see increasing area at risk to the 100-year flood right here in the city. We use GIS techniques, of course, and we can see that Queens is the borough, which is very, I think, important and interesting. It's not Manhattan. And this is with Mayor de Blasio emphasis on the neighborhoods and the communities. This is, and sort of bringing this out from what's happening just here in Manhattan to all the boroughs throughout New York City is so important. But climate change doubles the affected area by 2100 compared to the FEMA firms, and on the 500 it's 50% increase. So very briefly, how do we do this? And this is so important, and what we're working with the city on is so that the city can provide leadership, not just for the 5 boroughs, but the metropolitan region. We have to take a regional approach. Otherwise, what's the point if we're doing great in the city, right? But our 3 states, 31 or 32 counties, whatever RPA says now, we're all in this together. So this approach this metropolitan region approach is absolutely critical. Okay, here were the 5 factors. So which were the ones did we say? We said, we got redundancy, flexibility, resourcefulness, safe failure, responsiveness, learning. And these are the key players that in the metropolitan region approach we have to have everyone working on it, government, civil society, the infrastructure managers, of course, and the private sector, very, very important, as well as the knowledge providers. So we mentioned UCCRN. Just want to say that over 130 authors are working around the world in cities right now. Timon is one of the leaders of one of the chapters. Joe Towers is also on urban planning and design. And it is if you're familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, which provide the information for the nation states, for really the countries, this is the IPCC knowledge foundation so that cities can actually fulfill their potential. And we are, like everything else, like every other group, we are working towards Parris and to launch at Parris, and that's one of the things I was meeting with the negotiators about today. Finally, this is the last slide. I was asked to just mention the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the overarching framework under discussion at the UN to set the framework for the next 15, 20 years. And for the very first time, a new urban sustainable development goal is being created. And Mary and I have worked very, very hard on making, and with many of the city groups, all the urban groups around the world have pulled together to get this, for the very first time, have the importance of cities in the 21st century, the leadership role in sustainability, not just climate change. And the very short goal is to empower inclusive, productive, and resilient cities. So everything that we're talking about now then leads into the greater framing of sustainability. That's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to introduce Adam. Adam Parris is director of the new Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, of which I'm sure he'll tell you more about. Adam's worked for 10 years at the boundary of science and coastal management, really serving as a bridge between those two groups. And within the past year, he served as the lead author on the report for global mean sea level rise scenarios for the U.S. National Climate Assessment, and provided technical guidance and leadership on the sea level rise tool for Sandy recovery, noted as a sign of progress in President Obama's climate action plan. He also co-led the development of a synthesis on the state of science for sea level rise and coastal vulnerability used in the Hurricane Sandy rebuilding strategy that was developed by Obama's Hurricane Sandy Task Force. Adam currently serves as the lead program manager for NOAA's Regional Integrated Science and Assessments, otherwise known as RISA that some of you may know about, this program at the Climate Program Office, and is a nationally recognized program designed to inform decision makers and manage the risk posed by climate variability and change. And so we're very happy to have Adam here, especially because this new position of directing the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay is new, and I think probably new to many of you, and I was hoping you'd be able to introduce this to us. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, so this is going to be, oh, there we go. So I'm giving you a preview of everything I'm going to talk about before I'm actually going to talk about it. So what that means is along the way I'll just quiz you. And that'll be a test in the other resilience principle, learning. Are you learning anything right now as I'm going through these? Okay. All right, great. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Dan and Mary and Cynthia, with whom I've worked for a number of years in my previous job at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But I'm really excited to now be a New Yorker. And in many ways, I moved from sort of the national level to a city because of all the things that Cynthia was saying. I believe, just as Cynthia said, that cities are leading the way, and this is they are places where at the forefront of climate adaptation and resiliency. And today what I want to do is actually, I'm going to focus a little less on climate stressors in my talk, knowing that Cynthia would probably cover those. And there is an absolutely strong foundation in the work that the city has done with the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and try to actually focus on some of the existing, what we might refer to as the existing stressors that climate often exacerbates, things like coastal flooding, and this balance between conservation and development. So I'm going to try to put climate in the context of our existing setting and narrative. And the other thing I want to do, really the central point of this talk, is to suggest that resiliency as an inherent capacity that our systems have and that our society has is variable over time. So this isn't a target that we're going to hit and then we'll just be done with it. This is actually a continual process, which is why those 5 or 6 themes of resiliency or principles that Cynthia highlighted are really important, because it's a variable and we all take part in the narrative. So I'm going to do that by walking through and primarily focus on Jamaica Bay. But I'm going to walk through a timeline. This is not by any means a comprehensive timeline. It's not a full history of Jamaica Bay, but it highlights a few things. And what I want to show is places where we've been more resilient and less resilient over time. Again, some of the stressors and sort of impact categories, if you will, that I'll focus on are coastal flood risk, water quality, and conservation and development. So we'll go from roughly the 1850s or the mid-1800s to today, with some gaps there in the middle, obviously. So we'll start at 1844. This is a historic map of the city and Jamaica Bay, and what you can see is this stippled pattern here, this pattern that you see rimming the bay and on the interior of the bay, shows just how rich the wetlands were around Jamaica Bay. So back in the mid-1800s, you have a really diverse complex of wetlands and a natural system unfolding. So then you skip forward to about the early 1900s. This is a map from 1917, and you can see some of the development starting to occur on the Jamaica Bay shoreline, and even the Rockaway Peninsula, and in Brooklyn. So a a little more development, including Floyd Bennett Field. So this is early, just before World War II. We actually filled in parts of the bay and the shoreline to create Floyd Bennett Field, which was a major, I'll skip ahead real quick, a major base for operations for the U.S. during World War II. So this is actually a snapshot from Floyd Bennett Field during the Second World War. Amazingly, it had not occurred to me until putting together this timeline that right in the middle of that, right before really the outset of World War II, but after Floyd Bennett Field had already begun construction, was the New England hurricane of 1938, or the Long Island Express, which was a very deadly storm and had widespread impacts. This is a snapshot of some kids being evacuated from a house in New York during the storm, but it was a costly storm for sure. In the 70s, of course, there were a number of national scale environmental legislation, including the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972. So a lot of this type of development and resource management in coastal areas specifically, where wetlands were being filled in and people were considering really actually sort of covering over coastal zone areas, was happening all over the nation. And it caught the attention of Congress, and the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972 was passed. There are a number of different elements of this legislation, and it is still, as you can see by the amendment to including linkages to the Energy Policy Act of 2005, this is still in effect today and actually has a lot of bearing on how we manage our coastal zones. One of the sort of foremost statements right at the top of the Coastal Zone Management Act is that we recognize that we value certain things out of our coastal zone. Things like recreation, aesthetic value, ecological value, also commerce and development, in particular ports, transportation. In many cases, our coastal areas are entry points for the shipment and movement of goods. So we have this piece of legislation dating back to 1972 that really makes a statement about what we value out of the coast. Starting in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, we started recognizing some trends, and there were coastal zone management programs in place for New York City, but folks started noticing some trends. I'm sorry for the blurriness of this figure, but basically what it shows is nitrogen loads, total nitrogen loads, monthly average loads going into Jamaica Bay from 1991 to 2006. And then there was also quite a bit of work being done around that period of time showing how much marshes were disappearing in Jamaica Bay, in the interior, not just on the shoreline. So now we're beginning a period of what I would say more resilient actions, particularly on the part of the city. So the city has been at this for a while, and I think one NYC that Dan recognizes really, visible, we'll end there, but it's a visible and clear commitment to sustainability rooted back in some of these earlier efforts, like Local Law 71, which established the Jamaica Bay Watershed Protection Plan. So there were a number of different activities that were taken as a result of this. One of the updates in 2010 noted the beginning of upgrades to the wastewater treatment plants, and the city has been able to, through actions like this, dramatically reduce nitrogen loads in Jamaica Bay. There's still a ways to go, but it's been a remarkable commitment over the past 8 years. Also, as part of one NYC's predecessor, Plan NYC, was the New York City Comprehensive Waterfront Plan, Vision 2020. So it's a pretty forward-looking document of how to plan out New York City's waterfront in a way that recognizes all those values. Then Amidst this period, Hurricane Sandy happened. Obviously, Cynthia mentioned and Timon mentioned a number of the impacts with which you are all familiar. A pretty swift and I think strong response from New York City that Dan was centrally involved in, Stronger, More Resilient New York. In all of these documents, the city had built up a foundation of science and a process for interacting with, as Cynthia put it, knowledge providers, not just as sort of a go tell us what the information is, but actually interacting with the scientific community around these questions of knowing here are the goals for sustainability and resilience for the city, and what do we need to know? And there was a lot of information being provided. So if you step back and try to think of this as this very crude way to look at it, but if you think about it, there are periods of more or less resilience. So there were periods early on where the systems were more naturally functioning, and as development occurred, maybe we were in a period of less resilience, but more recently there have been a lot of efforts on the part of the city in particular to establish more resilience. So what I'm currently involved in at the Science and Resilience Institute of Jamaica Bay is to lead a consortium of universities that have partnered with the city and the National Park Service to really realize that vision for a resilient Jamaica Bay, something that I think would be a boon not just for the city, but for coastal cities all over the world. So the kinds of questions that we're trying to address are, what are the relative magnitude of these events? So in other words, resilience to what? Here, Hurricane Sandy is just sort of a very small, I've intentionally, because we don't, we hope to actually bolster this with more research, but this is just a small sliver on the timeline, and yet we know that the impacts are much greater in scope than perhaps my little box on this timeline would suggest. So we're trying to understand what are the relative magnitude of these events, not just as they happen, but over time. What are the goals for Jamaica Bay? How are we embodying 1 NYC? Resilience of what? What do we hope to obtain out of Jamaica Bay, and what are we learning over time? So again, what SRIJB hopes to do is really harness the power of these leading universities in the city and in the region around questions that the city and the Park Service have that help us realize our goals for resilience and sustainability. It's easy when you step back and you look at some of the development that's occurred around Jamaica Bay to sort of say you could be pessimistic, but I think when you're actually on the ground in the bay, there are so many beautiful natural resources and so much rich wildlife and diversity that can still thrive in the bay, that really the hope is to provide the knowledge to manage this resource in a way where when people think of the Manhattan skyline, they don't just see the built infrastructure, they also see this tremendous natural resource, and it becomes a symbol for the city's resilience. And that's it. Thanks.
Mary's a friend and an inspiration, really, and one of the reasons is because she has really dedicated herself to improving the city, and especially in terms of thinking about resilience and how to build resilience at the community level. And so I thought it was really important in this sort of high-level overview of the climate science and some of the big resilience efforts, especially from the Mayor's Office of Resilience and the new Institute for Resilience, to get some input from Mary, who's the Vice President for Urban Livability and Resilience at the Municipal Art Society. This is a century-old advocacy organization. I'm sure most of you know it, and if you don't, you should. Working to promote the livability and resilience of New York City through effective urban planning, land use design, and civic engagement. Mary supports MAS in its programming and advocacy work in New York City, and she does this in particular around urban planning, land use and urban design, and cultural development in ways that strengthen the livability and resilience of the city and the region. Mary's collaborated with the regional Rebuild by Design program, which I'm sure also many of you are familiar with. This collaborative initiative of the Federal Hurricane Sandy Task Force and the MAS Global Network, which is a peer-to-peer learning platform connecting urban practitioners and contributing to livability and resilience of cities all around the world. And just to mention, previously she spent 5 years learning about these kinds of small-scale, granular approaches to urban innovation while supporting the New Orleans Institute for Resilience and Innovation, which was a loose alliance of initiatives that emerged in response to the complete system collapse in 2005 in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And I'm sure we can see some parallels there. And then Mary will talk to us about that. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here, and I want to thank Timon, my pal. We cross paths, and Cynthia and I do too, and so does Dan. Happy to meet you, Paul. We're just, I think, at an interesting point in trying to have a new discussion about how cities and resilience is actually about people. And that it's not only about large-scale systems, but it's actually about agency and how individuals can affect the capacity of our cities to be resilient and to be livable and all the things that were just suggested. We spent this morning, I have some of my colleagues here from MAS, they might want to raise their hands, Joanna and Lawrence, I don't know who else is here. We, since Sandy, have been working with communities, and a lot of people say, well, what is a group like the Municipal Art Society engaging in issues like resilience? And the point that we would say is that we've been around for a century, and we are about the spatial city. We're actually about how the physical city affects economic, social, cultural, and environmental outcomes, and that people are the ones that are mostly affected by these decisions. And so how do we actually get people to be informing how those decisions are taken? And so when Sandy hit, we realized that it was this extraordinary wake-up call for New York City neighborhoods to come to terms with what these challenges were. And we have, as a result, been convening and working with groups across the 5 boroughs, particularly in those neighborhoods that were affected directly by Sandy, but also other parts of the city that have other kinds of resilience challenges, not just water inundation, but something else, to try to engage those folks to recognize that this is their challenge too. That is, as broad-shouldered as Dan Zarrilli is, it can't all be done by him. And that also large-scale systems fixes are extremely expensive to develop. They take a long time, and they often fail. And so the more dependent we are on those kinds of large-scale interventions, the more we become just sort of, we get lulled into this false sense of security that all's well, when in fact, we need hyper local granular solutions. And so a group like MAS that's been around for a century, we were created by the Victorians. We were created in 1893, and we've endured all the different waves. I love the timeline you showed and the different ways in which we could see the evolution of the city, because MAS has been present through all those different eras, through an industrial era, post-industrial era, through the City Beautiful movement, through all the different ways in which, through urban renewal, we've lasted through that and been the continuous voice to suggest that there needs to be a very careful, close relationship at the hyper-local level between how you conceive of and how you actually implement the built form of the city, how it's built, planned, how its public spaces are designed, how the buildings hit the street, all the different ways in which physical planning affects it. And MAS has that whole constituency in its reach. So I'm happy to be here, and I love the title. I've been Googling it, or not Googling, I've been whatever it is. What about tweeting? I've been tweeting it the last 2 days. I'm old, so I get the terms confused. I've been using social media to talk about cities under siege because I think it's a really interesting, as Cynthia made the point, and all my colleagues are making this point, that this is an urban discussion. This has to be an urban discussion. And we make it local not only because we're the ones where the rubber hits the road, we make it local because really innovative practice comes at the hyper-local level. With all due respect to the academics, and we're in an academic institution, academics will tell you their dirty little secret too, which is that the really smart ideas come from the people that are on the ground experiencing these things. And a really capable academic is the person who helps listen to that, package it, connect it, quantify it, and do all those things. But if you want to look for where the really innovative practice is, you've got to go right to the ground, literally to where the neighborhoods are, which is the hard lesson we learned in New Orleans. After those levees failed and every other system collapsed, we could see, as the city rekindled itself, literally rekindled itself, that you have to look at the hyperlocal. So post-Sandy, we did these convenings. We just started having discussions. And the wonderful thing about being an MAS is we have a lot of credibility in the city in a very broad way. We're not seen as, oh, those environmentalists, and we're not seen as, oh, those narrow-minded, whatever other activists you might want to tarnish us with. We're kind of everybody, and so we can convene a big discussion, and we started to make this point that it had to be an integrated discussion. The one concern I have about the popularity of climate change and climate change resilience is that we're going to make it only about climate. And we all know that when you go into a community and you talk about something as specific as climate, what they'll start talking to you about, which Dan is reflecting in the one New York NYC report, what they're going to start talking to you about is poverty. They're going to start talking to you about health care. They're going to talk to you about lack of infrastructure, all sorts of systemic barriers. This morning we had all sorts of statements around historic inequalities in Queens, how that affects the capacity for anybody to withstand anything. So it has to be an integrated discussion, and it has to involve as many stakeholders as possible. So we produced this report and tried to make that point. Single interventions don't work, and so in response to the question Timon you're kind of put to us, I really feel strongly that we cannot, as much as I want to have everyone pay attention to climate change, and lots of people don't, it can't only be about that. Because people will not meet you there. It's too abstract, it's too narrow. It's got to be about poverty, it's got to be about equity, it's got to be about all sorts of other kinds of things that climate change exposes. So we've been building this framework with principles and various things, and thank you for the plug about MAS. Go to mas.org and you'll see the work we've done. We'd love to have you as a member, because MAS is a society that's driven by its members. It's part of what makes us credible is that we have thousands of people like you who are behind us saying, how about this, what about that? And we did rebuild by design because we felt it was important that designers, how many of you in the room are designers? Come on, you can fess up, you can put your hands up. The great thing, again, with designers, just like academics, the best design is the design that's rooted in the practical and informed by the local. And so we wanted to make sure that Rebuild by Design, which was going to have all this federal money and all this attention put towards it, benefited from community input. And so we helped with our partners at RPA and NYU and the Van Allen to make sure that communities were actually engaged in this process so that their knowledge and expertise actually informed what the designers were working on. So that's our question, are we more resilient? And as I suggested, part of what we feel we have to be continuing to zero in on is it's not just about climate resilience. What about the fact that we continue to have this extraordinary inequality? We're the third most unequal city in terms of income distribution in the country. And that has all sorts of ripple effects, and it affects our capacity to be resilient anyway. Here are the maps that you've been seeing. We used this morning in Queens. Again, local folks are not focusing on this very much, despite all of our efforts. They're really not. And so I'm hoping one of the discussions I'd like us to try to have that nobody really wants to have is that when I saw those historical maps, didn't I think this? What are we doing building on our coasts? What are we thinking? And here's the problem, and it's a huge systemic historical problem everywhere. The cheapest land is the most vulnerable land, and that's where low-income folks have been settled, relegated to, where all that pattern of development has occurred. And so here in New York, we have thousands of properties now within the FEMA flood zones, the revised zones. They're going to have incredible insurance burdens. Many of them will not be able to meet them. We have 404 NYCHA buildings, I think, that were affected by Sandy. And remember, the next threat isn't going to be Sandy, it's going to be something else. So I think it's, again, we can't rely on government to ask a very tough question, which is, should we continue to be building and restoring on our waterfronts, or should we be rethinking this in a whole different way? Should we have a tough conversation about managed retreat or whatever we want to call it? It's got to be an equitable conversation. This is not an easy conversation to have. But a lot of it happened in the first place because the decision-making wasn't well-informed and it wasn't equitable. So now how do we compensate for that now? How do we have that conversation? And in spite of all those tough conversations, you have this. This is what community resilience looks like. I said this morning in Queens, in these consultations we're doing in the boroughs, I reminded people that actually Sandy did us this huge favor because it gave us this extraordinary jolt so we could actually see, first of all, what might be ahead. It's prophetic in that way, but it also demonstrated, look at the remarkable capacity that New Yorkers have to self-organize and be remarkably responsive and really creative and innovative. And they do it much more quickly than any of the large institutions or systems that you think are going to waltz in. Think of all that stuff. We've got to really think about how do we capitalize on that and build upon that to build our own resilience. To us, it's just such a simple concept. This is how cities look. This is what cities and neighborhoods do. When you have a need, you collectivize. You find a place where you can get that need met, that aspiration met. And after Sandy, we saw this. Somebody's garage, somebody's bar, it might have been the public library, it might have, all these things. Often civic assets make it more possible, but sometimes we improvise and we do it in a tent. And then once we get that kind of cohesion and that sense of mutual aid going, then we need to kind of reach out to one another and find out, well, what are they doing in the Bronx? What are they doing in Queens? How do we connect with Staten? So that's part of what MAS's mandate is try to build this network, a kind of resilience network of a two-way, multiple-directed thing. This is my favorite guy. I always put up David Brooks because I love right-wing journalists. But here's why it's important, It's important for us to realize that actually cities and resilience really do transcend ideology. Because I think it's grounded in the practical. And what Brooks is saying here is, this is after the BP oil spill, which hit New Orleans a couple of years later. If you Google David Brooks, Jane Jacobs, you'll see some interesting things he's said over the years. He's fundamentally interested in organic and how cities develop organically. And after the BP oil spill, he said, please, let's listen to the locals. Let's trim the experts and trust the locals in terms of how solutions need to be incubated. And so these ideas and this instinct around how cities are built organically, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, they come from not always the most predictable sources, including a David Brooks writing for the New York Times. So these are some principles we've been advocating around self-organization, around the importance of data being democratized, around civic assets, the actual buildings and structures and places, which can be owned by government or maybe owned by a private landowner, that actually work as these hubs. And why don't we invest in them now before resilience happens, before we have a challenge, so we need a resilience. I like, this is my D statement. You see that? It took me a long time to work that out. Distant, detached decision-making dooms democracy. We have to localize. Let's localize. New York used to be famous for localizing. It used to be. Community boards, it used to be. We've got to restore that. And then this notion of peer-to-peer networks. MAS Cities is this network we've been building because we realized that New York's not alone. New York's an extraordinarily important thing. When Rebuild by Design, and Cynthia, I appreciated your jingoism in favor of New York. Because Rebuild by Design, when Governor Cuomo came to make the announcement with Sean Donovan, he said from the podium, New York City is the most important coastal city in North America. It's probably the most important coastal city on a number of metrics in the world, and the least of which could be that we are innovators here and that we have a tremendous amount to do to test and try out new solutions. 10 years ago when I was a funder, back when many of you were in public school, elementary school, and I was a funder, we could not talk about adaptation. Do you remember these days? It's only 10 years ago. Couldn't say it. Weren't allowed to say adaptation. Well, now 10 years ago, we're now saying it. And we should be on the forefront of really brave, ennobling, innovative solutions, which I think will come from the local, that Dan will then enable to take to scale, and that the academic community can find and test and do all that stuff. We should be on the forefront of that, so we need to get brave, and it's only going to happen if we do it. Because those kinds of pushes can only really come from community and from individuals. It's very difficult to ask government to do that. They'll never be that far in front. We have to be. And that's what we've been trying to cultivate with our MAS Cities Network. So, thanks.
Thank you, Mary. I want to ask all the speakers to come up and join us on a panel for questions so that we can open up to questions from the audience. Clearly, there's a reason I asked Mary to go last. I knew she would sort of tie things together and be provocative at the same time, and I will
just
do
make
it now.
sure.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm usually having to run back in the middle of the night.
Right, exactly.
Thank you.
I'm going to start us off with the question, and because we're a little bit later on time, and I'm sure that you have many questions too, even though I prepared questions for each of you, I'm just going to start with one, and sort of jumping off from where Mary was talking, is thinking about what we have here is both, in terms of the panelists, this sort of representation of the need to build resilience at community scales, at small scales, as well as to be thinking at the sort of city and regional scale. And in Adam's remarks, we started to get into a little bit about what we mean by resilience, but I thought we might actually start with that, because we haven't quite wrapped our heads around it. And Cynthia, you presented a number of principles for us to keep in mind, and the same thing from Mary. But I thought for the whole group, and maybe since we gave Dan the least speaking time, Dan could start, is to ask, what does it mean for a city to be resilient? And what do you mean by that? And then maybe once you answer this for all, we can maybe target what is some of the low-hanging fruit for becoming more resilient as a city, both at small scale and large scale.
I think the most important thing in that question is that it's resilience or resiliency as a city. It's important to think of cities as a system. I think it's important that we think of ourselves as an integrated system of people, neighborhoods, infrastructure, and how that all interrelates. It's not that it's not that you have a resilient building necessarily. It's like that building fits into a system and serves a function. What I think is gets difficult in this conversation is measuring resilience and what it means to be. Yesterday, maybe an absurd example, but yesterday we were 4 resilient and now we're 6 resilient. Actually putting a number to it and measuring it is incredibly difficult, and I don't think we've actually figured out how to do that yet. We've been doing some thinking in the city on how to hold ourselves accountable and measure our progress, and we've recommended a few measures to do that. Fundamentally for us, it's about the capacity and the readiness to withstand and emerge stronger from whatever shocks and stresses are coming our way. And it isn't just about climate change. It's important to think about a broad range of impacts that could be coming our way, both natural hazards, climate change, evolving economy, aging infrastructure, growing inequality. It's a whole range of things that we need to make sure that we're ready for the future. But actually putting a number to it and measuring it and knowing that you're moving in the right direction is incredibly difficult. And we're guided by the NPCC, of course, and others. We're continuing to test out the right metrics for that. I don't think we've actually landed on the right way to do that, and I would love to hear, perhaps if the other panelists have thoughts on that as well.
Actually, I wanted to draw on the board. Do we
Yeah,
have some?
ooh, please do.
Why not? So
gonna put
actually,
up
resilience comes from
This
physics.
is a backdrop. Go ahead.
Right? And this is the diagram that's often drawn, that here is the system, and that resilience is from a disturbance that takes you here, that you are able then, the system is able to go back to where it was. But as we saw, I think in all of the presentations, and what's really happening with resilience to not only climate change, but to all of the challenges, is that we now are putting in the forward motion that we're actually having to learn, and I'm going to add the new T word, which is becoming along, which is actually, I would say, the new concept, which you're probably already discussing, is transformation. That what we're actually doing is not just going back to where we were, but that we actually have to, as we go into the future, that we have to be creating our systems that are going to be, as Dan just said, stronger, and are going to be able to do this as we go through the future and the challenges through time. So I wanted to draw it because went beyond, we're definitely beyond physics now in the definition of resilience.
Adam, you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, thank God we're beyond physics. The thing I love about language is that you can make a word mean whatever the heck you want it to mean. Have you learned that? Like, that's something you can learn. You can make it say, you can make it mean what you want. And I use resilience in such a simple way: the capacity to adapt to change constructively. And so I like transformation. I like the sort of mystical quality of that. But I think that this debate about, and here's where it gets concretized. We all know these big fights that we've had with FEMA for a dozen years about the fact that they'll only support you to return something to the state that it was in before. And it's just infuriating because nobody wants that to happen. Obviously, because the reason it failed was because the state wasn't adequate, for crying out loud, so we want to make it better. But I know some of us love measurement. Numbers matter to lots. There are others of us that find that a bit burdensome. But here's what I would say. I think if there were a way to identify how resourcefully connected New Yorkers are so in other words, so if you did, come on, all you brainiacs that do network mapping out there, If we could get a really strong descriptive social network map that showed us how well-connected a New Yorker is to source the resourcefulness quality, to source any kind of other need that they don't know they have yet, but they will have when the challenge comes. In other words, how dense a weave is there around every New Yorker to be able to innovate, improvise, get their needs met. Eric Kleinenberg wrote a really smart book. I'm sure many of you know it. It's called Heat Wave. It was about the extraordinary heat event in Chicago, and he really showed that in the neighborhoods where the neighborhood was planned in such a way that the vulnerable populations had access to multiple resources and lots of people, they fared fine. And in the parts of the city that was designed in such a way that people were isolated from one another, that's where they perished, which is why this kind of connection matters.
See, I just let everybody go ahead of me because then I don't have to define it. I can even just point to Cynthia's figure. I mean, I wouldn't, I'm not going to, I like Mary's sentiment that we can talk around the definitions all afternoon, and probably we each bring something to that language. But I think that really, in terms of how you define resilience, one of the more compelling, and they're not even principles, they're more like characteristics of resilience that is going to define how well we come to know resilience is learning. What are we learning from, development to development, restoration to restoration, event to event? There are all these different contextual factors that move us as a society in one direction or another. And, we have to understand what we're learning. And that's not something at all that I think is beholden to the scientific community. I think it's sort of collective learning. Hopefully what we're trying to do, for example, with the Science and Resilience Institute, is design a system for learning. So we've got a resilience practice report coming out, and the idea is really to sort of say not just what is this from the scientific standpoint, but what are the practices that we might test and experiment with and employ to learn how more or less resilient we are. But I think it does, there's that fundamental question of resilience. Resilience of what? And that's that, well, there's of what and to what.
That's right.
And of what is really something that I think New York has a very strong identity, but, it's one that we constantly have to evaluate.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you for all the feedback on it. And one more sort of follow-up before we open up is I'm thinking about, and so Mary, you mentioned, measuring social networks or trying to understand social cohesion, and maybe in a way, and I know, Dan, we've talked about this before as well, is, what do we need to know in order to help improve resilience, especially since it's different in different neighborhoods, but we don't really know how different it is yet. But what do you see as a group as the low-hanging fruit for maybe not just measurement and quantification, but really improving? What are the things that we can do in the short term? What's sort of the 1 year, 2 year low-hanging fruit from all levels?
So I can just quickly give an example. When I think there's lots of hopefulness around this. There's tremendous entrepreneurial opportunity around this, right? And there's all sorts of people that are improvising solutions and coming up with ways of, the city is a city of entrepreneurs and tinkerers and people that have been coming up with stuff forever. That's part of what is in New York's DNA. So I think that's part of the challenge, and I've appreciated the way EDC has initiated some of these competitions to try to get entrepreneurs to tackle this stuff. The tech community is starting to do it too. What are the tech these hackathons that folks have to be able to tackle things? There's tremendous resources that exist in New Yorkers we just have to tap on. And one of the really low-hanging ones for me, and it has to do with connection, are mesh networks. To me, the impact that we will see, 10 years ago in New Orleans, we were not texting. You guys don't remember this, but 10 years ago, we were not texting. We still had fax machines 10 years ago, and none of them worked. So mesh networks, it takes us to this post-internet age where all of a sudden we're going to have redundant communication systems, which to me is that networking piece. So if somebody's stranded on the 32nd floor, won't be stranded because the electricity goes down. And I think there are lots of little fixes like that that just connect us better put us in touch with resources better, and I think that's going to have a catalytic effect.
I liked your answer. And one of those competitions that she's describing is something called Rise NYC that we're doing as a city, which really was looking at how technology and different technologies, power, telecommunications, building systems, how we can use those for better resiliency. We conducted a competition. We're going to ultimately be aligning the winning competitions with small businesses and applications across the city. We're going to be announcing some winners on that fairly shortly from the results of that competition. And this is one of those areas where the federal government was able to be flexible, and using some of the Sandy recovery dollars, we're supporting that competition with about $30 million to support the ultimate application of those technologies to small businesses across the city. It's an incredibly important competition, and it is part of that low-hanging fruit that's going to continue to help us connect and make ourselves better off.
As a scientist, I have to speak up for numbers. We're going to be in each one of the NPCC reports, we've talked about indicators and monitoring. And because of this ongoing situation and the need for flexibility, there needs to be more than ever this, I think, in utilizing the new technologies and the new media, but to have a system of the collection of what are the programs, how are they working, who's doing it, after there's the storm, how many people really are using that, for example, and documenting it. Because then we're going to be able to then to make the kinds of flexible responses and changes and mid-course corrections that we're going to need. Because climate change, I'm focused on climate change, but it is indeed so challenging because we don't exactly know what the future climate system will bring. So that's why we have to have a system of indicators and monitoring in place that is working with all this new stuff, but it's not just the numbers, but it's also folks who are analyzing the numbers in communication with the city folks who are then figuring out, okay, well, this is working, this isn't working, let's try this next, so that we can be very nimble as we change, as we go through the path.
I would just take that a step further and say that some of the information, the scientific information that goes into those indicators and that monitoring is qualitative in nature. We want to be interviewing and doing focus groups and engaging communities to understand what are their perceptions of different risks, how are those changing, and how does that change their values. Those are things that actually feed into the indicators and come from one of the reasons why this is an interdisciplinary endeavor and a transdisciplinary endeavor is we have to be able to draw on the social and behavioral sciences to be able to understand that qualitative information. The other thing I would say, going back to Mary's point, I completely agree that it's important to understand social networks and that social network analysis is a valuable tool. In fact, one of some application of social network analysis in nature climate change has shown that one of your ability to actually reach transformative change is dependent not just on the strength and connection of your networks in an individual region, but the ability to learn from people in similar contexts outside of your region. So that's why UCCRN is really valuable, and that's why we hope to be able to partner with other coastal cities to see what are they doing, how are they learning, and how do we get to the strength of weak ties.
I got two more low-hanging fruits. Can I?
Go for it.
Okay. We need to find some policies to invest in local businesses and strengthen local businesses, because in the event of any kind of a disruption, the recovery time for the local business is much faster than the chain. So they're more nimble, they have an investment in the community, their workforce is usually more local as well, the decision making is made locally. So there's just a very simple thing. Start spending a lot of dough in your local businesses. You want to try to find a way for neighborhood businesses to be as strong as they possibly can. And the mesh network thing that we're talking about, and the Rise NYC competition that Dan referred to, most of those proposals, which I was fortunate enough to be on the jury on, and it was so hopeful for me when I saw what entrepreneurs were coming up with, were aimed at quick local business recovery. So that's the first thing. Very easy to do, and we can all do it. We can all do it, and we can pay attention to the different policy initiatives that are being put forward to strengthen local business and local retail. The second thing is similar kind of thing, civic assets. What became instrumental post-Sandy in Queens? Public libraries. They transformed themselves into staging areas and recovery centers, and they had the facilities, and so we can look at local parks. Where did we all go get our phones charged? We went to the Starbucks. In Staten Island, the picture we're showing there, what was the hub in Staten Island? It was a guy's bar. He had generators. He became the hub. He still is. 2 years later, he's still doing Tuesday night soup and stuff for people. So this kind of self-organization, you know, we can encourage city government and other partners to start investing in those civic assets, which are instrumental in times when we're not under stress, but extraordinarily important when we are.
And it's important also, I mean, at the bottom of this in terms of thinking about knowledge sharing and the whole learning aspect of resilience is that the knowledge, we have to actually collect the knowledge in order to do that. So a lot of the things that you're speaking of are because we have actually there are people out sort of mapping this out, studying this to try to bring that. And I think the Kleinenberg example, you know, post-Chicago heat wave is the classic case we're all using because they've gone in to do the work of studying that. Yeah. I want to open it up to the audience. I know you have questions. We're slightly technically challenged in that we don't have a mic roving around, but we are videotaping this. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is speak loudly, and then I am going to repeat your question for the audio for people who couldn't be here today to the audience. And so 2 points about it. Try to keep your question brief and to the point, and we'll start just kind of going around there, and we'll start here in the front. Yes?
I have a question in terms of the role of government and public education.
Could everyone say who they are, please?
Yes, and also, thank you. I had 2 points. I only said one. Please, yeah, say who you are.
Cynthia, I'm a professor of social sciences at NYU, and a question about the role of government in promoting public education with respect to 2 points, renewable energy and also reduction of solid waste. So in terms of renewable energy, the New York Solar Map identified 650,000 rooftops with solar potential, which would have generated about 14% of New York City's electricity overall, 49% during peak usage. Now we have 2,500 installations, 2,500 out of 650,000 with potential, generating about 30 megawatts. We have a peak usage in July 2013 of about 13,500 megawatts. So there's a huge gap. So my question is the role of public education with regard to renewable energy as well as energy conservation efficiency. And the second, in terms of recycling solid waste, New York City now recycles about 19%. How do we get from 19% to the new goal of 90%?
So let me summarize. The question was about the role of governments and public policy, and sort of 2 issues. One is about achieving a higher of the potential in terms of solar energy in the city, and the other is about doing a better job in terms of how we handle waste.
Cynthia?
I can, but please, Dan, please.
No, it is a great question. There is a role, it's probably not the only role, but there's a role for government to continue to educate people. And the New York Solar Map is great, but I think you highlight that there's been some barriers to get more people to put solar and other renewable and distributed generation assets. Something that we announced in September is a retrofit accelerator. When we announced our 80 by 50 goal, we want to encourage people to be generating more on-site power. And there's some barriers, there's some incentive programs, there's some ways to pull that together. What we've typically found is the big sophisticated building owners have the knowledge, have the means, and the financing to be able to do those types of projects. When you get down into the smaller building stock, the 50,000 square foot, the 25,000 square foot buildings, you have a part-time super, or you have, people that aren't necessarily, that's not their focus and that's not their job every day to do those things and to chase down the incentives and to figure out the technology to make it work. We're setting up some programs in order to help do that. So part of it is education, but then some of it is, hand-holding in some ways, to walk people through the process, to figure out how to do the financing, how the incentive programs work, what's the technical know-how, and to package it up in a program to do that. So that's at least one answer. And I think the government has a role in there. It certainly isn't the only role, but it's an important one. But it's also important as you think of the city as a system that we're continuing to improve our reliance on renewable sources. On the new zero waste goal, there's a range of things, and this is, by 2030, we want to see 90% reduction of our waste going to landfills. That's going to require a lot of effort. We need to certainly increase our composting. Something like 30% of the food waste of our waste is food waste. Increasing composting is a big piece of that. Increasing our recycling is a big piece of that. There's ultimately pulling as much of and extracting out of the waste stream as much as we can for recycling and reuse is a piece of that. We can get into the specifics in a lot more depth, and I'm happy to point you to the resource here to read through that. And then we're going to be continuing to roll out more and more of those programs as we go. But it is not a trivial commitment on the part of the city for zero waste. It's something that's incredibly important that we do. In fact, it becomes, I think this is the words of the mayor this morning in announcing it, it may be hard to do, but it's necessary to do. And so we're laying out the ways that we're going to have to meet this goal, and it requires all of us to ultimately take an ownership of a goal like that, and in the choices we make every day in plastic bottles versus reusable and everything else. There's a range of things that we need to do, but we also need to have the systems in place to support that. And I think that's what the city's role there is.
Can I take another question?
Hi, I'm not that chair. I was wondering what we can do to make it more known that we should not build on the coast anymore. I mean, I love the Ferry, and I live near the Brooklyn Bridge Park, and I'm completely horrified at all the condominiums that are going up now, right on the water's edge. And I don't understand the logic of the city, because apparently the park is already paid for. It's not as if they need the condominiums for that. So I look at that and I feel that's going to be gone, 20 years, 25 years. So, I mean, how can we make that more, more known?
And I'm just going to keep repeating the questions for the sake of audio, but the question is about waterfront development and how to sort of broaden the messaging around some of the challenges and maybe some of the problems around the fact that we're continuing to develop along the waterfront.
So I guess in responding to that, there's sort of two things going here. The broader coastal development, in much of the city, the coastal development is already in place. It's generally not encouraging new development in the floodplain. But what we see across the city, and post Sandy, I think this bore itself out. The newest structures are actually the safest ones to be in across the city. Looking at something like Arvin by the Sea and the Rockaways, looking at even the development of Battery Park City, things that are built to modern building codes are safer than what is the real challenge across the city of existing buildings. We have 400,000 people that live across the city in the floodplain, many of them in single-story timber bungalow. Bungalow communities are incredible challenge, but just generally existing buildings that weren't built to modern standards are much less safe, and that's where the destruction and the devastation from the storm itself was most prevalent. The things we're doing to elevate homes, the things we're doing to use land use as a resiliency tool, all of that is really addressing the key challenge of an existing building challenge of 400,000 people that are living in a floodplain right now that aren't making the choice to develop new or to build new structures. They're already there. And so we need to think about that as a city in terms of how do we reduce that risk? How do we think about the long term? How do we adapt for the future? That means land use changes perhaps in the future. That means upgraded building codes. That means upgraded zoning codes. But I think we have to start from the point of people, generally, we're already here and the climate is changing on us, and we need to think about how to adapt. The specifics on the park and how that is paid for, and generally, that's a whole different conversation that we can have another day, perhaps. But
this is as Mary said, and is one of the most important questions for our region, and that there's clearly need for that's a lot of public discussion about it as the kinds of events and that have been described here, and I think it's also this very much an opportunity for the learning from other cities. Let's see what other cities have done. Are there ideas? Certainly, we have a very strong partnership with the folks from the Netherlands and the Dutch, who have probably been addressing these issues for more time than we have. They're kind of our great-grandmother city, really, and cities there. And so, and they're finally taking a very mixed portfolio approach to answer these kinds of challenges. That some is, living with the nature, allowing those ground floors to withstand. Everybody knows the boat example, but there are many things. So I think having lots of discussion right here in the region, but also really opening up to ideas from cities around the world, and and we're going to be able to come to, as we go through time, come through the decisions for our land use planning that are right for New York.
I just want to reinforce what my colleague is saying. This has to be a conversation. Ideology isn't very helpful, and that's one of the problems we've had, is that there's been a knee-jerk reaction. We won't abandon the coast. And it's very complicated, because there are lots of vulnerable folks that are in these situations, and so they don't have a lot of choices. At the same time, we know that New York needs to densify, to accommodate whatever the number, what is it? Who had the numbers?
9 million by 2040.
Yeah, there's a few people coming in a short time. So where are those folks going to go, and where are they going to live? And so density is a much broader discussion that many parts of the city are struggling with. And so I think it's a multi-layered conversation, in the same way that resilience to coastal challenge means multiple lines of defense. If we want to actually do that and encourage wetland restoration and do what Jamaica's doing, but not just in Jamaica Bay, but everywhere else, and restore that, it's probably going to mean relocations. And that is an extraordinarily difficult discussion around equity, fairness, and resources. But I just want to make sure we're having the conversation. I worry that it gets shut down, and we have this kind of temptation to be muscular New Yorkers. We are not going to abandon anything. And I want us to channel a more accommodating conversation.
Adam, did you add?
I would amplify the one thing that Cynthia was saying, which is, living with the land, or living, as the Netherlands said, their initiative is living with the river. Which is a stark contrast to what they have, what the national flood defense policy is in the Netherlands, which they established a while ago, and that was really the cultural paradigm for flood protection in the Netherlands for the past 20 or 30 years, and they're now realizing what that has done to some of the other land uses that they hope to preserve, agriculture, ecosystems. And then amplify something that Mary said, which is, these are all choices. There's a great set of works the National Academies put out, America's Climate Choices, and that framing was intentional. A lot of these things have to do with choices. We don't have actually a history in many places, let alone coasts, of putting ourselves in like the most safest, sustainable spot. There are people developing in the arid Southwest, which could, by some people's definition, be in a mega drought. We are putting ourselves in places where wildfire is going to continue to happen, and perhaps in more extreme ways. And we're also developing the coast. And so, and yet you look at tribal communities in the Southwest, and they've been able to grow corn and other crops in very dry climates and very dry spaces for a long period of time because they lived with the land. So we really have to be able to have the conversations, as Mary said, be able to work through conflict and through displacement. And I'm not sure that we're prepared to do that yet. But we can get there, and I think ultimately, though, it has to be framed as a choice on the part of both individuals and government. It's not just on, the city government.
And in New York, maybe we have more choice, I think, than maybe in some other parts of the world. I mean, in a lot of places up in and around the water's edge, which is the majority of people are living on the water's edge now. You have to live with the water, and that's the state of play. Not everyone can pull back, but we have choices. So I'm going to let some other people have questions over there to the back, and then we'll work our way front. Yeah.
My name is Joseph Lavard, and I've been accepted into the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management Program here. And I was just wondering how the city and its various partners and institutions plans on developing the workforce who will then make the city in turn more resilient.
How does the city plan to develop the workforce to make the city more resilient?
No, what a great question. Some of the things that the city is thinking about at this point and actually is embodied in this plan of really preparing New Yorkers, and this is not just in an environmental focus and not just in resiliency, but if we're going to be moving people out of poverty, if we're going to be addressing income inequality, we need to make sure that people are prepared for the jobs that are going to be here in New York City, and that means, it's educational improvements, it's workforce development, CTE investments. It's a range of things that are ultimately increasing skills, improving opportunity, getting people to the point where they can take advantage of the job opportunities that are here and improve their station. And that applies certainly with, we think in terms, a $20 billion capital program. There's going to be a lot of spending that happens around resiliency, even in the short term. But making sure that we're hiring locally, hiring from sandy impacted regions, that the people that are most impacted from events are able to participate in the recovery and the rebuilding is incredibly important to us. And it is about that, building that pipeline of higher skills and capable workforce that's going to be able to help us do that.
I'm really excited to answer this question. We don't, I'll speak to a couple of efforts that are not solidified yet, but that I think whether or not we get funding for them, we will continue to work towards. We just submitted a proposal to NOAA speaking to environmental literacy, where we would work with kids in 7th through 12th grade to develop an after-school enrichment program where they would document how weather and climate impact their community. Take photos, have journals, and even using rain gauges, collect data that would be reported to the world's largest climate data archive at the National Climate Data Center. And then they would eventually start thinking about strategies, coping strategies and resilience strategies, and present those to folks like Dan at the city. And so we're targeting younger students, and then also through the undergraduate and graduate students that work at the Science and Resilience Institute, do research as a part of the Science and Resilience Institute, by virtue of their interaction with folks like Dan and folks from the National Park Service and DEP. We're anticipating that really we're not just setting young scientists, young scholars, young practitioners on a path towards on the sort of typical academic career track, but also be the future workforce for city government and for resource management entities. So we really feel like, having practitioners and scientists involved in the Science and Resilience Institute will, over time, create a system for learning and a sort of training future workforce.
We have time for a couple more questions. You've been waiting. Thank you.
My name is Baron Roth. I teach sustainable design in various programs here at the New School. Question for Cynthia. Can you share your insights on the upcoming climate change negotiations in Paris and why we should be more excited than others about that? Seems to be rising expectations there. And then another question for Adam and Dan. What can we do about the open landfill in Dead Horse Bay down around Jamaica Bay? I was shocked when I went and visited recently. It's fascinating, but also horrifying to see that, with each and every high tide, there's more garbage just being pulled out to sea. So,
Two questions. One about the road to Paris and expectations about what may or may not happen in Paris, and the other very local question about Dead Horse Bay and the open landfill there.
Yes, on the negotiations, there is a widespread global perception and motivation that the negotiators at this time have to culminate in a viable response treaty to climate change. Basically, after 20 years of basically nothing happening, I mean, it's really has been, I have to call it as a failure. And there is finally the realization that combination of the and I think the motivation to do it is multifactored, but it's an understanding that the climate change has been occurring and occurring even in a more accelerated way than projected in some cases, and also that the impacts are, in terms of fundamentally changing the way that our planet functions, is also very deeply understood by people around the world. I think also the nation states are finally, the big divide, of course, has been between the low income countries compared to, of course, the rich countries who have primarily caused the problem. But because of the, I think, share this view that they're actually the entire set of nations has to do whatever they can in that distributed way, rather than imposing so many strict. I think they've finally come to they're coming to this differentiated responsibilities. That being said, so it just from every meeting that I go to around the world, there's this growing real feeling that it's going to happen in Paris at the end of this year. Now, it won't be everything, so we need to not get our hopes up completely. And that one of the last questions I asked the negotiator that I had lunch with today, I said, well, we were discussing this very thing. He said, look, this particular part of it, it's very, very complex. Just diplomats can basically, if you give them, they've just proliferated all of it over time. That it's, hundreds of pages, but this particular team is working on 90 pages. He said, we have 90 pages of negotiated language. And he said that he calls it the beast. And he said, it's very, and I said, you won't be able to, what he was sharing was, we won't get everything. The countries will not be able to agree on every single thing, but there is very much there is true hope that history, there is a real feeling that history is going to be made in Paris.
Thank you, Cynthia. And the question about Dead Horse Bay.
I have no good answer on Dead Horse Bay, so I'd want to look into that and get back, or somehow otherwise follow up. Sorry.
Yeah, I would second the need to follow up. I'm aware of the issues, but I just don't know. Hopefully what we can do is sort of the role of the Institute, provide Dan with information he needs, along with, DEP and others to make informed decisions about how to improve the situation.
I think we can report that we stopped dumping horses in the bay. I think we can say that at least.
Can I just say one more thing? Actually, just back to the negotiations. About, as I said when I was giving my presentation, because we're talking about cities today. So exactly how the local government's part of the and the local actors' part will be framed, I think that's still very much up in the air. Again, whether there's going to be a huge movement in terms of actual negotiated language on that. I think it's that's an area that is challenging, I would say, but there is definitely a feeling growing around the negotiations about the role of the cities. So it may not be in the actual negotiated language, because to get anything, you wouldn't believe if to be there when they're doing it word by word and fighting and then and arguing and then having these contact groups, and it's just going on for hours and days and days. I mean, sometimes at the meetings I've been to, they've spent 3 days discussing the agenda. I'm telling you. So that's why we have to also be realistic. But I'm just reporting to you from some of my being right there in the room with the negotiators. But I think that there is a climate of movement around the cities and the role. It may not be in the actual language itself, but it is beginning to be recognized, the role of cities as the key implementers of so much of the response to climate change, both mitigation adaptation.
We'll take one quick last question right here in the front row, and then we'll have to stop.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your contributions and all the work that you do. I wonder if the word, the phrase sustainable cities is actually an oxymoron, and that cities, they're parasitic organisms and they develop out of a love of commerce and wealth generation and economic activity. What would a city look, what would a human organized living situation look like if it was informed by, love of life, love of living systems, value those things? What would it be a city, or would it have a different form?
Thank you for the
So
question.
I can respond to that.
Okay,
Do you want to repeat
perfect,
it?
Mary. Yeah, so the question
That's
is,
a great
is a sustainable city possible, and what might an alternative form of a city be that's maybe based on different principles, not so much governed by commerce and economic activity?
So
Would that be okay?
I'll just respond as an urbanist, and because I'm work for an organization that is actually about cityophilia. I mean, cities are about love, and cities are about fundamentally about self-organization, about us coming to an agreement that we're going to collectively share our lives, and that somehow together we can meet our needs and our aspirations more effectively than we can in isolation. So I would take exception to the characterization of a city being parasitical. I think a city is extraordinarily generative. I remember an anecdote about Jane Jacobs, who was a famous urbanist, who lived in New York and in Toronto, and near the end of her life, she had always been concerned about monocultures in cities. She'd been concerned about when capital in a city forces out diversity, and you start to see only one kind of development. And she was very critical of Lower Manhattan, that it was only about the finance industry and that it was going to be dead. It was going to become a completely dead zone. And someone went to her late in her life and said, Jane, since 9/11, that area has had unbelievable resurgence and regeneration, and people are moving in there, and now people are living there, and they're working there, and they're taking trips there, and there's all sorts of different kinds of activity. That diversity has re-knit itself back into that part of the city. And this person said, you were wrong about Lower Manhattan. And she said, yes, life is right. And that's the potential of a city. We're here together and we are collectively realizing what I think is probably humanity's greatest creation, cities. So I guess I'm on the other side of the spectrum with you. I think that cities have the potential and the seeds to be this remarkably generative and hopeful thing, and it's incumbent upon all of us, and particularly the designers in the room and people that are involved in structuring and spatially enabling the city, to create opportunities for you and I to realize our aspirations collectively.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank our speakers. I'm sure they know, and I know that you are incredibly busy and hardworking people, and for you to take time out of your schedule today to come with this is a real benefit, and so I appreciate it. Thank you again, and thank you all for coming.